He's in the Army. I should be able to talk loud enough, right? So, actually, China, we can see it competing with the United States and the West, with a whole government approach, trying to prevail, trying to be a regional, if not global power. So things didn't go how we wanted it. So we had to say, hey, we had to treat China and Russia for who they are, not who we want them to be. We wrote a national security strategy that acknowledged that we are in great power competition with our strategic rivals. We need to cooperate where we can, but compete where we must. And the last administration embraced this. I'm an international relations guy. For those of you who know that national interests are enduring and it shouldn't be politicized. So the current administration's national security strategy, national defense strategy, more similarities than different. There's a recognition that China is a pacing threat, that we are in great power competition. Now, the Cold War, we prevailed. Where was the technology that helped us prevail in the Cold War coming from? Big government labs, big defense primes. If we built an incrementally better large end systems like aircraft carriers, submarines, fighter jets every 10 years, we could stay ahead of the Soviets and win. And we did. The problem is, where is the technology that we need to compete and prevail in today's competition? Not just the military, but across all of government coming from? The commercial sector, right? Think about the technology you guys are familiar with, and we're going to hear about this course. AI, autonomy, cyber, those types of technologies. And where are developments and advancements? Back in the day in the Cold War, technology advances were driven by government directives. They said, let's improve this technology so we can build a better large end system. Now it's coming from the commercial sector, advances are being driven by consumer demand, not government directives. That's changed everything. So to be effective, we need to be able to, identify, adopt, and deploy those technologies coming out of the commercial sector at speed and scale, or we're going to lose, and that's not going to be pretty. So, Silicon Valley and the government have to be closer than ever before, and you're going to hear from a great range of number of speakers in this course, who are kind of working that nexus between Silicon Valley technology and the government, because, we want to win this competition too. All right. The vision that we have for the future, where a rules-based order is going to endure. It's a vision that's not just America shares, but it's shared and embraced by, so many of our allies and partners around the world. And I'd say it's in the balance. It's going to be determined here in the next 10 years if we're going to prevail, if that vision for the future prevails, or the alternative vision that, which is very different, prevails. So, it's an important class, important topics, great speakers. And, thanks again, Ernestine and Paul, for the chance to join. And over to you, Paul, to introduce some folks. But
thanks, Joe. Thanks for having us. So I'm Paul Kwan from General Catalyst. Excited to have one of our portfolio companies, Applied Intuition, kick us off for this semester. Qasar Younis, CEO, co-founder of Applied Intuition. Thanks for coming by.
Thanks for having me.
So we're going to set the bar high. Is this on? Can you hear us?
Yes, it does. Yeah.
Set the bar high. We have
or low.
A quote from my partner, Hemant Taneja, who you've known for a while. Why is Applied Intuition so interesting, right? It's a tier 1 software supplier transforming the auto industry. This is, in Hemant's words, the only founder that's been able to do a complex enterprise software company to transform an industry with high growth and high profitability. We've just never seen that in our history. So, we'll just jump right into it.
Very flattering.
Yeah. Walk us through real quick, Pakistani American, grew up in Detroit, went to General Motors Institute, now Kettering University. Why autos? That background growing up, as a kid.
Yeah, I think if you ever grew up in an industry town, and kind of the Bay Area is kind of an industry town. Industry towns where everyone's making money from the kind of the same thing. You go to Houston or something like this. You fall into the industry kind of as a default. We're immigrants. My parents were uneducated, so if you're strong at science and math, you're going to go to U of M. That's kind of the best of the Midwest. That's even a pejorative. It's a great school, but that's kind of the horizon. University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And I kind of I don't know if some of you have had this feeling, but when you're in high school, there's a little bit of a resentment, especially if you're not in the inside. And for me, that ultimately led to man, am I just going to be another one of these Ann Arbor kids? And GMI, as it was known when I went to the school changed its name to Kettering University, is a very unique school. The rule of the kind of the shorthand is the West Point of automotive. It's a small private engineering school. Very much, it started by General Motors 100 years ago when there were not enough engineers. And GM said, well, what better thing to do than just produce our own engineers? And the school still exists today. What's unique about it, if you guys know Waterloo, you work half the time, you go to school half the time. So you have to have a corporate sponsor, and that's a requirement. So you have to start interviewing right when you get out of high school. And if you don't get a job, you don't go to school. Like, it's a requirement. And so you have to be a particular type of person who's like, I want to work in corporations. I want to be an engineer, and I don't mind living in Flint, Michigan, which is, not Stanford. That's the most polite way. As we walked in this really nice campus and like birds chirping, I was like, this is not Flint, Michigan. And so I ended up there because I didn't want to do the mainstream thing. And I do love the car business, still love the car business here. And the way that's related to defense is, if you don't know, the car business and the defense, kind of primes, they're like cousins. They're very similar types of engineers. They build vehicles. A lot of them are based in Detroit, Michigan, Taycom and General Dynamics Land Systems and BAE. All these companies are in Southeast Michigan with large tech centers. And, so very much grew up in the shadow. I mean, Taycom was right outside of, my neighborhood. Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the things we come away with today is kind of how Applied Intuition has transformed the auto industry with software, and then increasingly the defense industry. So we'll come back to that as well. We'll also talk about the incredible career you had at Y Combinator. So along the way, you became a GP and CEO at Y Combinator. And I think for you all in the audience, it's an incredible privilege to have Qasar here. He's probably one of the most sought after founder startup advisors out there, bar none. And so we'll go through some of that as well. But before we get to all that, let's go back. You're in college, or right after college. What do you think you would have told yourself then, knowing what you know now?
There's a lot. But I would say, let me just, shorten it to compress it to the 2 or 3 things I think, that were correct. A lot of things I would have told you that probably were wrong. Correct is, you have to figure out your long-term trajectory. So if you're undergrads, early 20s, you graduate at 21, 22, and you have essentially like 2 or 3 paths in front of you. One path is, grad school. The second path is go work at I'm talking hyper local here. So this is not like if you're in India or if you're somewhere around the world, that's going to be very different. I know this is recorded, but this is for like Stanford students. One path is startups. And then one path is large companies. And then it's like, where does VC and all this stuff fall into? So maybe let's use a framework, which is a spectrum. And I kind of always think of everything on a spectrum. And one end you have being a founder, and the other end you have working, let's say, at the DoD. And so you can put every type of job on the spectrum. And so what I'm really saying is, on one end you have essentially the unknown kind of path, which is the path you have to create yourself. And the other is there's an institution, and you're going to join that institution, and the institution is going to teach you how to be a professional or whatever the occupation that you choose. And so now you have to figure out, the next thing you figure out is, okay, am I on the disruption side or am I on the institutional side? There's pros and cons of both. On the institution side, the pro is just like you're at Stanford. And I said this at Harvard last week. You came to Stanford and don't fool yourself. Part of the reason you came to Stanford is there's a brand. It's an institution. You're learning from this, from the professors and the other students here. And when you walk out with that hoodie that says Stanford, you represent, it's like being in the military. It's a very established rank and order. And that works. So what are the downsides of that part of the spectrum? The downsides of that part of the spectrum is frustration. If you go join a large corporation like General Motors or Google, or an established house like McKinsey or Goldman or whatever, Kleiner Perkins, you're just a cog in that system. And that's the intention. You're going to learn, but you don't really have a lot of provenance. You don't have a lot of, determination, to what you're going to do. On the far other end of the spectrum is you can say, you know what? I hate all those things. I was never, I'm going to be in the rebel battalion. And I get no uniform. I get nothing. I get no training, nothing, but I fight the fight that I want to fight. So that sounds very appealing. Well, why doesn't everybody do that? Oh, the downside of that is you pay with, instead of frustration, you pay with fear, because you have no idea what the future holds. And you could spend your time doing a startup or whatever that thing on your own is, and then find out after 5 or 8 years that you learned very little and you have very little to show. And that's actually a very disadvantaged position, because all the people who are on the other side of the spectrum, they've accrued skills. And so when you're 30, now as you compare each other to look at the similar opportunities, that could be financing, literally could be getting money for your company. Actually, that person might be more attractive. And so this is the kind of multivariate problem that you have to figure out, which is like, what am I good at? What's the risk I'm willing to take? What is my financial situation? What can I eat? And for me, I always thought, that I was on the rebel battalion because I was poor, and it was startups and starting a company is a non-linear way to grow wealth. It was an extremely pragmatic reason why I entered startups. Nothing else. In Detroit, in Michigan, there isn't a whole startup ecosystem. So for me, it was a very cold, methodical, this is how I don't become an employee. I used to work at my first job was McDonald's. And I said this at Google. I worked at Google for a bunch of years. I said, there isn't much of a big difference between a McDonald's employee and a Google's employee. The McDonald's employee and the Google employee both wear uniforms. We all have uniforms. We're all wearing a certain type of clothes that our peers will accept and deem to be appropriate for the function that we are assigned. And if you're a software engineer at Google, there is something that falls within that realm. And both people put in orders into a computer. And both, McDonald's and Google, there's not that big of a difference, but we imply there's a lot bigger of a difference. And so I think for me, I always thought that's almost, I was allergic to that. And I also believe I have a weird name and maybe, all the insecurities that you have as an immigrant. And so very much I thought I did this for wealth accumulation and for the system might not accept me. As I work, and I've worked in big companies, 5 years at General Motors, 2 years at Bosch, 2 years at Sears, 3.5 years at Google. So over a decade in large companies, over 100,000 employees. And, when I was at YC, my most recent thing, I had kind of surpassed all the things that as 22-year-old that you want. At 22, you're wondering what, all these things, and you get family and all this. And now I'm checked all those things off and I realized I still wanted to do a startup. And I think fundamentally it wasn't actually money and it wasn't anything other than I function the best in this part of the spectrum. And that took me 20 years to figure out. So you have to figure out, ideally in less than 20 years, what part of the spectrum that you fall, and then you optimize your skills based on that.
And I think that was incredible advice there, Qasar. Kind of compressing all that into those sound bites, the Google versus McDonald's. I'll never forget that.
Yes, yeah.
But
sorry to my Google peers who are watching this.
You're at YC, helping run that. Obviously the preeminent, tech startup accelerator. What are some of the non-obvious things about starting a company for those who want to go on the founder journey that are not obvious? You talk about this linear checklist progression. Let's just share some of that wisdom. Because again, that's having seen all those cohorts at YC, all those founders, all the missteps, kind of break that down for us. Yeah.
Let me talk about the mode that I think most Stanford students trying to apply to YC fall into. And it's the brand train. Sam Altman's talked about it. Some Paul Graham's talked about it. And the brand train is, you went to Andover or you went to, Philip Exeter or TJ or something like this because of either your raw intelligence or your parents' ability to help you put you on the right path. You can do a place like Stanford or Harvard or wherever, but Stanford in this case. And then from there, the next brand after is Google, or it might be McKinsey or Bain, whatever thing you want to go to. Then you might go to grad school, or you might go to Y Combinator. Y Combinator has just become another train on the brand train. And you see these founders who show up and they actually don't care about starting a company. They actually, and the best evidence of that is like the equivalent.
That founder vibes. Trey Stevens last semester looking for founder vibes.
Yeah, exactly. Or like it's like it's any time that you're enamored with the superficiality of the thing without understanding the cost of the thing. Whether you go in the military because there's an emotional response, but you actually don't understand the mission. That is actually the underlying reason why you should do what you're trying to do. And so people end up in the YC bucket, we'd often see, because it's just the next brand thing to do, because it's what and I for everybody, but especially people in this room, you are heavily influenced by your peers to a degree that even if you say, I'm going to push back, you are a product of your peers. If we were in some, school in Cambodia, we wouldn't be having this conversation about startups. We'd be having a conversation about something very, very different. That's evidence. So the first most important question is, why startups? So once you're past that, YC is a fantastic on-ramp, because YC does what other funds have always struggled to do, which is look at people who are not vetted. You're vetted in some way. You're in network. You can probably go to, Anne at Floodgate. She teaches a class here. Paul is right. Top tier VCs are available to you. But for most people on the planet, they don't have that. And YC is a fantastic, on-ramp to that. And that's the innovation that YC has. Anybody can apply. Now, the I would say the obvious things that YC does, there's been talked about a lot, so I won't go over the same thing, which is it helps you focus, it gets you ready for demo day, it creates a pressure, all those things are absolutely correct. It's extremely valuable. The things that I think, now that I've done this company for 7 years that are kind of counterintuitive is, one is total underestimation of your ability and, requirement to recruit people. So many YC founders can raise that money or even get a co-founder, but they have no idea how to consistently recruit. So the recruiting isn't just, convince, Daniel to come join my company. That's not recruiting. Recruiting is understanding what we're good at, what we need, what we're weak at, what we need to build, what your skills are, where you are in your life, what experiences that you have. Are you going to be the right next person on this like hyper specialized team? Company, again, like an institution at a Google, you just want bodies. You're looking for humans to fill, butts and seats. On the other end of the spectrum, in the Rebel Battalion, you have because there's only 2 or 3 seats available.
You looked at like the skills you want to get out and who can do those skills as opposed to who's a friend of a friend or who's down the hallway, right?
But the reality of the situation, sometimes you only have the friend of the friend because you are one of hundreds of startups at YC and one of thousands in the Bay Area and all pitching the same thing. We raised $3 million from all these great investors. Come join us as an early employee. So the requirement for recruiting or the need for having a strong recruiting muscle is something I didn't appreciate when I was doing my YC company, when I was an employee at YC. And then in terms of, I would say number 2 on the list is the well-roundedness, requirement of founders. So I think, a lot of us being engineers, a lot of us being technical, we very much emphasize the ability to be technical. But people don't talk enough about the ability to actually be one. When you're starting a company, you're the chief executive officer. So you need to know the marketing function as well as your head of marketing. You need to know the, people function. You need to know sales. You need to know operations. You need to know engineering. You need to know product. You need to know design. There's like a dozen functions that you really need to know. And when you're 22, hint, you don't know any of them. Maybe not even one. And now you're going to go try to recruit somebody to be your head of people. And they look at you and they're like, you don't know how to spell HR, let alone build a function of HR. And that, by the way, goes all the way down. Engineering is especially difficult. With a situation where there's a very well-known YC company, I won't say the name, worth more than $5 billion. Very young founder, comes from a school as great as Stanford, was a dropout. And he asked me, how do you apply? How do you guys recruit such senior people? And I said to the person, well, part of it is I'm not 23 years old. And the reality is there's people like you who are 38 years old, who've been writing software for 15 years. And if you're 23 and you're trying to recruit them, good luck. It's going to be really, really difficult. So experience and well-roundedness, the ability in that second, that translates to recruiting, but it itself is like its own skill. The median founder, by the way, at YC is 30. So half of the founders are above that. And I think if you look at the top startups, with the exception of, I would say, Stripe, those guys are older now, but Stripe, when they started and Scale, I think everyone is like a fairly, the nice way to say old is mature. Everyone's a mature founder. And so if you really want to be a founder, I think it's not how do I get on the brand train? It really is how do I build up the capabilities that I can execute and build a company. And I think that's really is the focus.
Yeah. There's a lot of great content. I'm good. I think you also talk about the Paul Graham 18 mistakes founders make. You can look that up at 2006 blog. Definitely worth reading. You will get that, I think, every few months. So let's fast forward to applied intuition. Kind of like maybe just for the audience, like the size and scope of this business and the speed by which you built it, just to level set for people, like what you're doing and to kind of understand the totality of it first and foremost.
Yeah, I'll assume nobody here knows Applied. If you do, I apologize for the rehash here. So we're fundamentally a software company, and we build. If you take the Venn diagram of vehicles and software, what's in the middle of that is what we work on. We originally started the company just focused on tools, and those tools were specifically to build autonomous systems. And we conquered that market pretty well. I think there's not much debate if we're the market leader there. From there, we expanded to all software testing on vehicles. So if you're writing a web app or you're writing a mobile app, how you test the mobile app is maybe test flight or web app on your local browser. If you're deploying software to a vehicle, and that can be from a sports car to a tank, there isn't a web browser that you test it in. And we build the tools that allow you to do that. And it's a whole host of tools to do that. That's one business line. The second business line we recently announced, which was private for many years it's a vehicle platform. So it's a onboard a software that sits basically between silicon and the application that sit on a vehicle. Offboard software, the development environment in order to control and things do like OTA and vehicle logs, etc. And then the developer experience beyond that. And so that's our vehicle platform business. That's our second pillar. The third pillar is autonomy. And specifically, we do autonomy for defense. We specifically do it for the U.S. government. And that is off-road autonomy. So you're trying to, if you've heard of things like the Robot Combat Vehicle Program or XM30, that's the area that we play in. Within autonomy, within defense broadly, but within the autonomy verticals, specifically, we supply the existing primes like the General Dynamics and General Atomics and those folks, to the new primes. Anduril, is a customer all the way to the DoD directly and then all the subgroups, DIU and AFWorks. And so we're really a supplier across the full spectrum. And I think just to juxtapose like an Anduril as an example, an Anduril, cause you guys probably know the company, they very much position themselves as a new prime, almost like a antagonist to the existing order. And, the existing order being the 5 kind of, dominant primes in the business. We're actually very different. We're a horizontal company. We supply everybody. So, our view is our mission of the company is to accelerate the deployment of safe and intelligent machines. And so those safe and intelligent machines can be passenger vehicles and they can be commercial trucks and they can be dirt movers from construction or mining or agriculture all the way to defense vehicles. So that's what we do. It's I don't know if there's like a real comp of us in the industry. In each of the verticals, like in the tooling comps, it's like, if you guys know ANSYS, if you're any mechanical engineers, or if you're Cadence or Synopsys, that's kind of that. In the vehicle platforms, I guess NVIDIA, saying, this is interesting being the NVIDIA.
The software Bosch, where you work.
The software Bosch, yeah, exactly.
We have the iOS for transportation.
Yeah, exactly.
Kind of, maybe just jump to like the $1 billion question. The thing, we talk about GC is how you've been able to engage on the autos business, 18 of the top 20 OEMs. These are people who don't move very quickly, have incredibly high technical bars, maybe talk about the Porsche announcement, which is obviously a humongous outcome here. How did you get into these customers and help modernize and transform them, in just a few 3 years plus time frame? Yeah,
I'll use the General Dynamics example because it's public and I think it's a good illustration. GD came here, to an EBC, locally and, we met them. General Dynamics Land Systems is like, 70% of the land, market. They're the prime that does, tanks basically and troop movers. And, they wanted to use our tools to build autonomy systems. And after engaging with us, they ultimately said, can you actually help us build the autonomy stack as a reference stack? And so how do you go from the first conversation to let's say 5-year relationship where you're working in a very, very, complex and integrated way? The fundamental truth is, slowly and, in a very precise way. When you're working with large enterprises, you have to have like extreme EQ in the sense of the organization. You as an applied intuition has to understand what are the customer needs and how do you deliver what the customer needs, while at the same time recognizing we're not an engineering services company. We're not an NRE shop. We don't build stuff and then we just, sell our hours. So you have to kind of squint and figure out what can I build with this customer that will also be relevant to other companies that are like this, and are there other companies like this? If there are not other companies like this, you have to think long and hard, do I actually want to do this business? And so I think for us, with all vehicle manufacturers, they're all very good at manufacturing vehicles. So whether it's commercial vehicles, whether it's cars or tanks, what they're not good at is software. And that's where I think that's where the combination is very, very,
let's
very
just
strong.
Talk about like the technical complexity of what we build for our customers. We have to get it right. Obviously, we hire great technologists. We have the great culture, but like, let's just understand when you're building things that have to be 101% accurate.
Yeah.
How do we actually do that?
Well, I mean, I think the things that we just quickly ran over are important. Culture and who you hire. I think, it's in safety systems. This is the beginning, middle, and end, right? And so we work on obviously mission critical safety systems. So from the beginning of the company, I've done a bunch of talks on YouTube, so I won't rehash, how we run the innards of the company. But what Paul's really getting at is what are the functions that run the company? And in many, many ways, I think we've been extremely, intentional about how we built the inside of the company. Part of this is my third company. That's a part of it. Part of it is I saw the things that were incorrectly done at Google and at General Motors and other places, and it's a reflection to that. And part of it is that's how you run complex engagements. You have to be hyper organized, and you have to incentivize the team to do the right behaviors. So just a very quick, peek into like what that means on a tactical level. And I think what's worked really well for us. When our company was about 10 employees, we wrote out essentially what become our operating principles. We call them our values. But where most companies kind of falter on that is they never close the loop. So they write these things and they're kind of outside of the day-to-day work. And so what is the day-to-day work? Well, the day-to-day work is not only success in terms of the revenue multiple or revenue growth of the company. It's also compensation and promotion. And literally what you celebrate at all hands. And so all of that stuff is infused. All the values are infused in the day-to-day. So all the way from recruiting. If you're recruiting at Applied, we are judging you against the adherence of our values. That's the simple fundamental truth. When you're in the company, if you are, working on a project or success of a project, whether it's going well or not, it is around the adherence of the values, and then all the way to getting promoted and moving up. So I think it's just like, there's a bunch of, so we recruit from 3 schools exclusively, Stanford, MIT, and Berkeley. We found the right mix of startup people and technical depth. There's people for sure, in this room that work at Applied. You can just ask them, have a lunch or dinner, say like, why does the company do well? And it's a very, very nuanced answer. It's not like we just had lunch paid for. Like that's not what makes a great company. And maybe another way to think about this is if you're into sports or anything, like what makes a dynasty, what makes a great team? It's a coach. Yeah, it might be the quarterback or it might be the, specific, but it's the team, it's the culture, and it's a time and place. That's what you have to kind of figure out if you're starting your own company. And I think that's what we did with Applied.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of stuff you talk about in terms of like how that culture transcends into action and outputs. Yeah. Which is really well said, and the metrics tying to that. Just thought bounced in my head, Apple and cars. Yeah. What happened there? Should have called us first? I don't know, but walk us through that.
So, we know Apple well is all I can say, per non-disclosures. If you guys don't know, Apple shut down their car project. And the long and short of it is, I think it's very easy for the Bay Area. There's a lot of, arrogance, frankly speaking, for lack of a better word. When you've been on that brand train for a long time and you grew up in the Bay Area, you start thinking you're infallible, and these companies they can do anything and everything. And it's very easy, especially if you look at the autonomy ecosystem in 2016, 2017, to lob these, I would say, edicts over it, say, the OEMs are done and the future is Uber and Lyft and Waymo and Tesla. And that was very much the view when we started the company. Our most controversial things when we said to our, early investors like GC is we believe that the vehicle manufacturers, whether they're in automotive or other industries, are going to play a significant and prominent role even as these technologies are essentially AI enabled, become very, very intelligent. And I think everybody in the Bay Area was like, these dumb metal benders at Toyota and at General Motors and at VW and Subaru and, or Suzu or whatever the company was. They don't know how genius, we are here in Mountain View and in South Bay. And the reality is if you take the flip, you have a situation with Apple, one of the most profitable companies in the history of the world, spend $10 billion in trying to build a car and then not even have a demo to shows that actually the issue isn't that you are geniuses in Silicon Valley and everybody else in Detroit or whatever epicenter, they're morons. It's the dynamics of the ecosystem. What more clearly is because you work at Google and Google's a high margin business does not make you a good engineer. That just makes you an engineer at a high margin business. And so like one of the, again, like the blasphemous things you can say is like, is a General Motor engineer and is a Google engineer, you say, of course the Google engineer they get paid more and they went to great schools. It's not that black and white. It's not that black and white. And, so I think it's not completely opposite either, but I think you just have to have a more humble view as you enter these markets, including if you're Apple. And you would say, well, this is so why does NVIDIA, why does Apple, why does Google, why are these companies all talking about automotive? Because it's a giant industry. It's one of the few industries that are bigger than the Bay Area. And so as you look at, and as you are a company, your expanse is always growing. Automotive seems like easy pickings. And it turns out that's not a battle. That's as easy as it seems like. And especially when you spend so much time, so much money with one of the best companies on the planet to just shut it down. Yeah. I think there's big lessons to be learned.
Yeah. Hardware versus software. So you're pretty outspoken, software. That's because you spent a lot of time in hardware. You were in plants. There is a bit of a renaissance in hardware for the rest of the semester. Again, even like last semester, we have a number of cool hard tech, hardware. Talk us through that in your mind.
Yeah. So hard tech and hardware are different. So you can do hard tech and software. But, most of you guys don't know my background, but I was originally a mechanical engineer and worked in mostly electronic systems before I moved over to software. And I moved over to software pragmatically when I was in grad school. And it was, and I have the zealousness of a convert. I love software, because I spent that time in factories and you realize nobody compensates you. The consumer, you build like a nice watch. All they say is there's like a Chinese company that can do this cheaper. And so you're always under this, the pros and cons of being a hardware company are the pros. It's very emotional. You build a phone, you build a car. It's extremely emotional. You're very proud. I can still tell you the cars that I worked on as they drive by on El Camino. I can tell you there's a part on that car that I worked on and it still exists in the world and it's being used. So that's very emotive and very positive. The downside is it's just the market, the way that our economy works, it doesn't value it as much. So some of the hurdles are really high. The best Bay Area companies will say we're getting blended operating, gross margins at 30 to 40% for hardware companies. And hint, Google is not 30 to 40%. Google is 80 to 90%. And so every dollar that it's so hard to make from the ecosystem, you just keep a lot more of it. And I think that just deep in my heart because I've spent that time. And, so I think you have to figure that out yourself, what you like doing. Are there good businesses to build hardware? Absolutely. Will you have to do a lot more to get the same juice? Yes. So it's how much do you love that in order to
me in defense of hardware, and we talked about this last semester, I think, when you have bigger markets, you have longer customer cycles, right? It may not be contractual SaaS.
Tesla is a hardware company.
Tesla, the end rolls. Right. Yeah. So I think that's something we think a lot about. Can you get a premium valuation multiple for a software company masquerading with hardware? Right. Is that, so that's one of our,
I think I have that Google, the purity of the priesthood of Google, which is a web app company. I mean, Google makes Facebook look like an inefficient business because you have the moderators and all the social media. It's all this mess. Google Maps is which I worked on, is extremely elegant. It's just used globally and it's, or search or whatever it might be.
Yeah. So we'll take some questions in a little bit, but another kind of fun world one is, kind of AI. Super topical right now. You were at YC with Sam Altman.
Yeah.
When OpenAI got launched.
And Applied is obviously, if it's not obvious, it's an AI company.
What was that like back then? Just go back to that. So we'll talk about where's AI headed.
Yeah. So OpenAI was very different when OpenAI started, and it was very much a research thing, and it was an LLM. So in that way, there are lessons to be learned about OpenAI, which are, people will say, look, here's OpenAI. They raised a lot of money and they were a researcher and then they came out with this great product. We should all do that. No. That's not the lesson. That is the rare exception. Vast majority of companies that start as on the spectrum, applied on one side and research on the other. And applied means customer in the loop. They are paying you for a specific thing you're building. And the positives on the applied side is, when you write some software, people use it. That's an incredibly inspiring thing that you're not just doing things that never see the light of day. On the other side, on the research side, you get to work truly unencumbered. My general belief is research is best done in academia because then your incentives are aligned and you can really truly open up and do whatever you want. Let your curiosity kind of, to go in the areas you want. So OpenAI, I think, did this interesting thing where it somehow weaved both of them, but I would say being close enough to have an opinion, which is, I think there's more luck there than there was a repeatable, systematic, way of building a company.
And then AI on defense. How do you think about that?
And by the way, one last thing about OpenAI, and again, no disrespect, Sam's going to come speak at our conference, pretty soon. OpenAI still isn't a business. And a business, so we're all on the same page. Revenue minus expenses equals profits. So that's the formula. So if somebody tells you I run a business, you should ask them, are all three of those things exist in your business? If they don't have revenue, then that's definitely not a business. If they have revenue, but the expenses far outweigh the revenue, then that's not a business yet. That is still in the kind of the research and development phase. Once you actually have profits on the other side, then it's a business. And that's the bar that if you're like an employee and you're looking to join a company, you should ask those questions. Because if those expenses get too, you will get laid off. That's happened. That didn't happen a couple of years before. And everyone just felt like, oh, you just go to a high-funded, well-funded company and that's it. No, you have to put your brain on a little bit and say okay, what is the sustainable version of this? If you want to do research, the sustainable version is getting grants at Stanford. That is the way to do it. But in the private sector, that's not going to be the way to do it.
I don't think we've seen an enterprise software company that is both high growth and profitable. You see that in the small business side, PLG software companies, the Atlassians of the world, but that's why it's such a big deal for what Applied's done.
Yeah, and I think it's possible. I think it's as in there could be many more companies. At YC, we funded so many of these, the reason that they lose money is oftentimes they just don't have discipline. Right? That's the fundamental truth. And so I think if you are starting a company, that's an important constraint to put on, hey, I want to have the ability not to be dependent on investors. Because guess what? If you're dependent on investors, you're right on the end of the spectrum, just being working at Google. Now it's not your boss at the office in Mountain View, it's Paul. And Paul shows up to every, quarter and says, okay, are we going to see a path? And that's obviously when you're later stage, but that has to happen. That will have to happen. You cannot perpetually just spend money. Yeah.
Cool. Well, I know we can take some questions.
There's a lot to cover here.
We jumped around. Yeah. It's just so much.
One thing that we didn't cover, I think, is worth covering because of the nature of the class is Applied is also a unique company because we're a dual use company. And I don't know how many of you folks are familiar with this term. So roughly we build stuff for the commercial industry and we also sell to defense. Why this is important for the United States specifically is this is, especially when you talk about our adversaries where their private industries are an extension of the state, we are on that global platform sometimes directly across the table with them. And if companies in the Bay Area and companies largely American companies don't figure out this interesting dual use angle, that's actually really bad for everybody. And it's bad for you as a citizen. It's bad for the U.S. government, which will overpay for fairly custom things that are much more cheaply available in the commercial market. And so then we, as taxpayers, we're paying a lot more to build stuff that's basically the same and much cheaper. So I think if you are interested in defense, I would think deeply about going into dual use companies. Because this is where you can strengthen your commercial muscle outside of defense, but you can also move the mission forward. And I think that's a particularly compelling place in the economy.
Yeah, it's actually really critical. And I think, you guys talk about kind of how we make a software-driven defense infrastructure using some of Applied's tools, kind of a software silver bullet, if you will. I think it's critical that we get this right. Our adversaries are working on a centralized basis with all the resources with a direct partnership between public and private, and we're not, right? And, Steve and Joe can attest to that. That's what the whole issue is here. How do we bridge these worlds? And you all leverage the commercial success to build
subsidize. Literally, we're using the commercial side to subsidize our defense work. And that's the right way to do it. And maybe another way to position this problem is why are some companies only doing defense? Or doing federal work, gov work, and some companies are avoiding. Well, the companies that are avoiding is because they don't understand the procurement system. They don't understand how they actually take the thing that they have and put it into the DC system. Increasingly, people in the Bay Area and DC have worked on trying to smoothen this. It's not there yet, but the intention is there. Now everybody's on the same page that we want that to happen. That's already a big thing. Using the other side, why are there companies that only do defense? And they don't do commercial because it can become extremely lucrative. It's a cordoned off. We on the commercial side compete with everybody and we get hammered on prices. We have to be an efficient company because the entire globe competes for our dollar, right? It's not just companies in the U.S. When you're on the defense side, you can get this walled garden. And then if you know the procurement system, but you know why that's a problem? Because you become literally the thing you're trying to replace. You become literally another version of that old company that is maybe not as efficient.
Well, and that's what Trey said last semester. They want to be the modern Lockheed Martin of defense at Anduril. So that is some of that mindset. You kind of got me thinking here. How you went into defense how many years ago?
2018.
So you had no idea, really. Walk us through that and how you got into defense, and kind of the mistakes and successes you made.
Yeah, I would say so. It's both easy and difficult. And it's easy in the sense of it's like any other channel. You have a product and you have to understand how the channel consumes a product. And if you think about it that way, then you can methodically break it down. It's nothing beyond the comprehension of smart Stanford students to understand. What's difficult about it is oftentimes it's not the cognitive load of understanding. It's just the time and effort that it takes. And so the Lockheeds of the world, their advantage is they figured out the system over, 60 years, 70 years, right? Long time. And so now they've built an organization. And so when there's an opportunity, they can just kind of pop that up, pull that fruit off the tree. You're going to have to figure that out. It's all doable. And I think it is a effort that is worth doing. If you're a U.S. citizen and you believe in the cause of the United States, it's absolutely the right mission to do. So the thing that I would put in, the idea that I'm trying to plant in your head is it is possible to create a great dual use company. You don't only have to do a defense company or you don't have to only do a commercial company. And that alloy, I think, is actually way more powerful than each of the ends of that, the commercial strategies.
Yeah. And then just AI for defense. We obviously will have other people talk about this, Brandon from Shields coming next week, I think. But in your view, given what you see across land, sea, air, and just in autonomy in general, like how do you see AI in defense going?
Yeah, I think that's got multiple layers here. First is the emotive killer robots, scenario. AI is going to make decisions we have. Well, the reality of the situation is when a lethal system is being invoked today, it's not like done on a can on a string. There's already fairly sophisticated software that is already on board that Patriot missile. So this concept of like autonomy is this binary thing. And then one day we're going to decide that the killer robot's going to take over or not. This is an incorrect structuring of the problem. It is a gradient. And just like autonomy in your passenger vehicle is a gradient. There's a Tesla, there's a Waymo, there's everything in between, and there's all the way to just parking assist and it beeps when you're pulling into a parking spot. So there's a huge spectrum. So that's at the highest level. It's not binary. Within you can take lethal systems and non-lethal systems. Non-lethal is pretty straightforward. I don't think there's any let's say emotional, difficulty there to understand. Life-saving systems for our troops, we're all kind of on the same page. That's easy. Now let's talk about the more difficult question. Lethal systems and AI. We don't do this at Applied, but I do want to have this conversation because I think, especially for this class, it's a relative, and you'll hear different versions of this throughout the semester. The example here would be, okay, well, should we use AI within lethality? And the counter that I would have is, well, what's the alternative that we have? The alternative is you have an 18-year-old kid who's now had some nominal training, a year, 2 years, not in the battlefield. Do you not want that person to have the most sophisticated weapon system so they don't accidentally have collateral damage because the system is not actually intelligent? So you actually want to, so what's really happening and what I'm really highlighting is the problem that most people have is around policy. They don't have it around technology. And every time you guys have these conversations, always separate those things. It's policy that really needs to be debated. Should we engage? Should we go to this country? Should we support this specific initiative in this specific land far away? That's a very different question of should we have the capability? Because the answer of should we have the capability is absolutely yes. We absolutely need that capability. This world that we live in, this great campus and this, frankly speaking, very secure nation that we are, it does come at a cost, and people just don't like to admit that. And we can kind of ignore that only because it is so safe here. But if you live in another country, you grow up in another country, you grow up in a country that might be even unstable, I think you appreciate, that drink of water with an emotional resonance. It's much deeper than if you're just always expected it. So I think the capability, I think, is a definite yes. I think a non-lethal is a definitely yes. So then we go to that quadrant of, lethal and AI. And I think even though we don't work in it, I think you can make a pretty clear yes there. So it's really policy is what we're talking about.
And we think about for the kinetic lethal systems in AI, if the adversary has the capability to deter that threat, you must have greater than or equal to capability.
Yeah.
And so therefore, how do you get there?
And I think it's more clear today, via, the things that are happening, on the international stage, that it's still a violent world. Like that's also you can, I think, especially post, I love history. If you want to work in this, either in Silicon Valley or in defense, you should be a huge fan of history. All these lessons have played out in other ways in slightly different, let's say, tones, but they're very, very, very similar lessons have played out. But what happens post Cold War is we get into a certain zombie-like or maybe a comfortable state that actually maybe the world has fundamentally shifted. And I think we see now in 2024 in the last few years that maybe the shift wasn't as fundamental. And which means is we don't have the luxury to just kind of say that the most advanced technology should only be used for you to find your favorite restaurant, but not to protect the nation. I think that's kind of comical.
Yeah, we call that, we've had a vacation from history. We've had like a 35-year vacation from history.
Well, you've had periods of that in history.
Some stuff.
You've had periods of that in history. It's just that we're the ones living it right now. So it's like very, immediate. And so it's always new to you as the experience. But I think if you zoom out these 500 years, you see lots of repeating patterns.
Cool. Questions, audience, right in the middle, sir.
Thank you very much for coming here tonight. Quick question around the speed that you mentioned earlier and around some of the core values. Yeah. The number one value is speed, right? Like, how do you think about actually maintaining that speed as you scale your rebel battalion?
Yeah. So I'll repeat the question. Just it's like, how do you maintain speed as the company gets larger and it scales? Maybe again, like my always thinking is like, what's the opposite? How does a company become slow? That's like super easy. You can ask any of your friends who work at any large companies. There's unnecessary leadership checkoffs. There is isolation of information. So there's all of this overhead to communicate and figure out. There's very unclear goals. We're Google. We're trying to do everything. So now like, what does my team do in this everything team? And then it's like, okay, then there's a lot of that. So let's play the inverse of that. So in our company, speed means very clear focus, very clear ownership at the lowest level possible in the company, which means management is not to emphasize, it's actually de-emphasize, forcing decisions to happen at a lower level. Now, why don't all companies have decisions at a lower level? Because inevitably mistakes happen. But if somebody who had a better, a perspective, they would be able to prevent this. And I think you just take that as a cost. Small mistakes as a cost for speed are actually acceptable. But with large organizations, they will optimize to not make any mistakes at all. And how are they paying for it? They're actually not building new things. So the best way not to be criticized is do nothing. If you do nothing and you maintain your position, you will be fine. But the reality is, and the thing, it's even when your own career decisions, you're in a dynamic environment. The environment around you is changing. The competitive landscape is changing. The product and technologies that you're building and using and, deploying into the market, they're all changing all the time. And so I think for us, that speed has always been pushing it. And then we literally ask people that question. On a quarterly basis, we do some sort of version of survey. Quarterly, not annually. We're asking these questions. And we're not saying, do you think we're moving fast? That perception of speed is useless. It's actually like, what are the sub-behaviors? Is your manager immediately available on Slack? Is your, do you have a clear understanding of what your team is doing? Does your work directly impact a customer? And if we see any of and we have, many of 50 some of these behaviors, 10 values, 5 behaviors roughly. And then we're just looking at the company. We're just seeing and then we adjust. We'll adjust all the way to the values. Like as the company matured, as an example, quality was, I think, like a 5th value, raise the quality bar. It wasn't raise the quality bar. It was something like, a cultivate quality or something like this. And it wasn't sharp enough. And so, I don't know, maybe a year and a half ago, I don't know exactly when we moved it up to the 3rd value, and our values are in rank order. So the first one's the most important. Never disappoint the customers. Number 2, raise the quality bars. Number 3, all the way down. So part of it is just keeping your eye on the ball. Like you're asking people, are we doing this and are we not doing this? And then everyone has to be in agreement. Like if you create your values, like yes, Google, or yes, I keep picking on Google because I was there. But, let's say you pick Lockheed, another big company. Lockheed has to write their values. How can it be generic values? It's a giant company doing everything. It's like, be good, move. Like it's like Bosch.
Customer centric.
Yeah, customer, like Bosch is like, Bosch does, by the way, it's like a company makes like 80 billion in revenue a year. They do everything. And their like tagline is invented for life. Like, what does that even mean? Like what does invented for life even mean? Right? But it's because they're doing everything and they have to like, they have to, do this forever. But when you're a small company, it should be very, very sharp. So ideally, as you scale, you can keep those individual business lines very, very sharp, without having to like kind of this generic, generify the whole company. But that's the most general answer. It really is on a day-to-day basis. And if the leadership is not valuing, like they're not themselves, like one of the things we didn't talk about, decisiveness of leadership is probably the atomic core of speed. Including, this is not my call, this is your call, I need this done. It's not my call, it's your call. You shouldn't ask me 3 times. I can't be in the loop. If I'm in the loop, it's slower. I can't believe you waited for me for 2 weeks to ask this question, which you could have asked yourself. If you don't have that type of like conversation with the team, you're teaching the team. That's all. That's like, what's culture? In the most fundamental sense, what is culture? Culture is just the accepted behaviors between two people, whether it's in a company or a society. And so in a company, you're establishing culture every time you either do something or you don't do something. And so when people wait for me to review something, guess what the first thing I say is, I can't believe you guys are waiting for me. I'm at the stupid Stanford talk and this thing is still waiting, Like, and another way to think about this is, and we do, which is, this is how much payroll we have as a company. Every day is like this $1 million. So you wait for 3 days, we burn through $3 million. I'm using a round number here, but people start getting the message. And then, of course, you promote managers that instill that and you demote managers that don't. And you have to do the second part. You have to do the demotion. Culture is also what you're not going to be in the ways that you're not going to accept. So, it's a very long answer, but it's nuanced. Yeah. It's like, how do you maintain a top tier, basketball team?
That was insanely insightful. I don't even know if everyone appreciates what was just said. I do. It's just very special. Your question? Middle?
So I was wondering earlier, you mentioned about kind of elitism in the Bay Area and how a Google engineer and a GM engineer might not actually be that different. Yet at the same time, you only hire from Stanford, MIT, and Berkeley.
Yeah.
How do you reconcile those?
Well, number one, life, believe it or not, is in the gray zones. And so they're not just nice, quippy, short, sentences that have to stand the test of all, all examination. So yes, there's some contradiction there, because life is like that. But the very specific answer is, we don't have our recruiting team is 30 people, whatever. We don't have the bandwidth to go to GMI or to, Case Western, great school, or we do Carnegie Mellon, I should say, but we don't do it like Stanford, Berkeley, MIT, where we actually send people and recruit. So it's purely pragmatism. All of our values can be reduced to 2 words: radical pragmatism. And so, but yeah, I think, and to be very clear, why Stanford, Berkeley, it's even more specifically, it's very hard to get into Stanford. It's very hard to get into MIT. It's very hard to get into Berkeley. That's why. Whether you were helped and assisted along the way is secondary to the fact that it's still very hard to get in here. And there's a certain, one of the things we look for is cognitive ability. We look for smart people. Full stop. We don't make excuses around that. I think sometimes companies are also weirdly sensitive about hiring smart people. Like, we are looking for smart people and we don't want to hire dumb people. And so there's less dumb people at Stanford. That's just the reality of the situation. Now, are they culturally completely aligned with us, and do they have the right motivations and behaviors? That we also have to assess. And by the way, just because you sit in these classes, you all took the same lessons. So you have to, our interviews, we don't do fit interviews, actually. We only do technical interviews. And so you have to hit that bar first that you can actually do the function. That's not only writing software. If you're a designer, there's a specific, technical criteria there. The root word of technical is technique. So we're looking for technique. And technique sometimes is the actual application of the things you've learned, but also the creativity required to take the little pieces that you have into a new domain. We're assessing all of that.
Back there.
Thank you, Kevin. So you mentioned earlier that when you're working with enterprise customers, you have to recognize that you're not an NRE shop necessarily, but at the same time you have to deliver on this company.
Definitely, I would say necessarily.
But a lot of you do. I'm curious how you reconcile those two kind of concerns, recognizing that there's always going to be peripheral work to do on the NRE side, but also customer objectives are well defined.
You want to repeat the question for the?
Yeah. How do you maintain the North Star in building products as opposed to getting pulled into consulting?
Yeah, into NRE. Yeah. So, there's no, this is like the old adage, like it depends is the answer for every question in the universe. So I think the reason to do it, right? The reason to take on NRE is if you find that relationship with the customer is going to be one that's going to be productive over a long period of time. And, as much as people say like these are just, soulless procurement organizations, it's not. They're human beings. So you have to look across the table and say, is this human being that I'm working with, are they going to be true to their word? And if we work on this, we'll get access to bigger and more juicier problems. Or is their culture or is their behavior in a way that they will unlock bigger problems to me? Some people you can see are open to new ways of doing things, and other people are like, I need this widget made. You make this widget, I'll pay you. And once I don't need this widget, I'll stop paying you. And so you have to kind of assess and we have to make that assessment all the time. Another reason to do NRE would be that it is already on your planned trajectory. And this just will accelerate a pre-existing workflow that you have. And that might be something like, let's say, you were already going to build a data visualization tool. I'm just using an example. And somebody needs a data visualizer for construction. Now, like maybe 80% of the work actually you can reuse, and it is NRE, but it's also not really NRE because it helps you get to your mission. So I think, it's very, so a founder is really made. Starting a company, anyone can do. You can go raise money from YC or Floodgate or General Catalyst, whoever is, around the Stanford campus. That's not being a founder. It's like just being a dad. It's not just having a kid it's not just having a kid. Where you're really a founder is when you get feedback from a customer and you interpret it. The founders who are really good founders, they understand what to take, what to reject, what is NRE, what's not. And that's the true test. I don't know how it applies to being a dad, but there's something about being a father is like more than just having a kid, right? Yeah.
So, going back to what you were talking about for dual use companies, I'd heard that like a big issue is when you're taking commercial tech, trying to jam it into like defense. A lot of times, a lot of things don't work out, and so I'm assuming like you guys started as a commercial company.
We still are, yeah.
And so, I guess how do you balance what like general consumers want versus what the DoD requires, and also for new startups in the space, how do you recommend going about dual use if you have a set objective?
So, repeating the question, dual use usually meets headwinds because there are requirements that the government has of the technology that they procure, and those can be, let's say, detrimental, like we own your IP. Like there are requirements where if you sell certain things to the government, it's taxpayers' dollars. You as a taxpayer now own that IP as a part of the, I think you have to be very careful the work you do. And I think the government, whether it's the DoD, or the primes sometimes even have these weird, oh, you can only work with us. Like this is an exclusive. That's another version of kind of IP being hostaged. In the automotive industry, interestingly, that tends to happen a lot less. And the main reason is the automotive companies recognize a supplier that's captive to you is actually a very weak supplier because now they depend on your business. And if you somehow are in some trouble, they're going to be in trouble. So you actually want a supplier. There's 100 tier one automotive suppliers that do over $1 billion in revenue each. They're supplying the entire ecosystem. So then, and then so you take the Bosch example. Bosch does brakes. A bunch of people do brakes. Bosch does brakes at scale. So why don't they just build their own brake system? It's super easy. I mean, today in 2024 is because Bosch will take all the brake systems from the globe and put that demand into a couple of factories. And by the way, hire a largest brake engineering team that's known in the world, and they'll create the best braking systems, and they'll be cheaper than what any individual company can build in-house because they're distributing the cost. That's the core gears of capitalism, our distribution of costs, right? So it's distributing and understanding markets. So Bosch is basically looking at the entire ecosystem and saying, oh, these are the types of brake systems that exist, right? So you want to take that type of dynamic, you actually want to put it into defense. But there are some defense systems that you can't sell to other countries. So now you're breaking that very, I would say, traditional dual use. So for us, we're being very thoughtful about where we enter in the ecosystem. However, I would say today, more than ever, the DoD recognizes actually vast majority of technologies are not just for us. They can be, they're literally like consumer technologies. And so I think there's a appetite today more than ever before, which is like, oh, we'll actually use generally available technology for our specific problems. And we don't need to own the IP and the network and all of that stuff. So I think that's just it's a part of everybody here's job, whether you end up at the DoD or you end up at a prime or you end up at a startup, is to keep that education process going. Because in other countries, what happens is the government says, you worked on this interesting autonomy system. Well, now you're going to work on it for this tank. And it doesn't matter. The IP is not really yours. Even the land you're on is not really yours. It's all ours. And that's a very different system. And we obviously don't live in that system I think there's lots of benefits to our privately owned system.
That's an awesome way to wrap up. Thanks so much for coming by and sharing the insights. Really appreciate it, Qasar.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Quick wrap up. What you just heard was 25 years of wisdom. And it's sometimes hard when you're just listening to an hour talk to realize that each part of those words were actually hard earned and hard won. And let's see if I could summarize a couple of them. There was an immigrant story implicit in all of this, coming from a family where there was minimal education and literally took advantage of the opportunities that the United States offered. And in fact, I appreciate the Ann Arbor, Michigan story because that's where I landed out of the military, and I worked in process control installing systems in automobile plants. And one of them got me out here, the Ford Milpitas plant when it existed. That's how I got to Silicon Valley. But there's a second story. For all of you who heard it, I just want to play it back. The business of applied intuition is a business-to-business sale, but there's no brand name on that car or whatever that says applied intuition. They're a tier 1 supplier, which means they're kind of a very important supplier, but they don't make the car. They make essentially, and again, without minimalizing the value of the company, it's middleware for the car. But what's really interesting, it's middleware in the middle of a disruptive change in a enormous industry. That is, what's going on is that, Bosch and all the other tier 1 suppliers to the automobile industry for 50 years knew how to make electromechanical parts and then, discrete microprocessor controlled parts of automobiles. But now all of a sudden autonomy is here, and all of a sudden all the smart autonomy engineers are not in those existing tier 1 suppliers. And so the subtlety of what applied intuition is built is not just world-class technology, but trying to convince automotive companies that your existing suppliers are no longer the right people to look at. And correct me if I'm wrong, that there's a whole new class of suppliers that you ought to be looking at. Well, if you had a relationship for 50 years with a tier 1 supplier, imagine how hard it is to convince a world-class company, because some of your engineers have come from there or going back to there. They used to drink and have dinner together, etc. So the subtlety here is not just the great technology, but the great sales skills to do that. And so you ought to just appreciate that ability inside of a massive technology transition that's going on in the automotive industry and other industries to kind of insert yourself as a new supplier in a new category. The second part, again, which is just shouldn't pass it up, is this ability to actually, it's a 6-year quick story overnight to insert yourself inside the Department of Defense as the same autonomy story. Anybody familiar with enterprise sales in the commercial world, B2B sales? Anybody familiar with? So for those of you who do know it, it's incredibly difficult. Write that down, incredibly difficult, and then multiply it by 100. Trying to figure out how to sell to the Department of Defense. And the brilliant move here was not trying to be, because in case you didn't hear it, a Palantir or a Andrew going head to head with a prime, but inserting themselves again as a middleware supplier to the existing primes. So the existing primes who could not hire AI engineers with baseball start salaries that great VCs are providing to Applied Intuition now, in fact, can actually provide that same class of software by using a intermediate company like Applied Intuition and go head to head with an Andrew or someone else. That's a second part. Yep. So I won't tell them. But that's the second part of the brilliance of the story you heard. So again, I just want to summarize 25 years of an overnight success, each part learning from generation to generation. The other piece, that I just want to leave all of you with, and I think I'm going to write a blog post on it, is the brand train versus the mission train. And that was a great phrase, because all of you are now part of that brand train, right? You're going to have a Stanford degree. It kind of stamps you as the best and the brightest. Boy, that's the only way Applied Intuition, as they just said, will even look at your resume. If you went to Stanford and maybe a school back east with a second-rate education over there. But there's another career that, again, we'll talk about in multiple sessions here, about a mission train, about people who dedicate their lives to other parts of the mission. And I think that's an interesting kind of contrast to choices you'll have to make. So we're honored to hear the story. I think it's an amazing story. You've built an amazing company, and the lessons here are deep and important. And you're going to be hearing a ton about this company, and you're probably going to be driving in their cars pretty soon. So thank you again.